panel is going to focus on the topic of navigating the conflict of personalized medicine versus population health management, this tension between individuals in treatment versus thinking more on a population basis. And we have three distinguished panelists. I'll give a brief introduction. We have Dr. Burton Vanderlaan, Medical Director of Priority Health in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Dr. Kavita Patel, who's a Fellow in Economic Studies and Managing Director of the Brookings Institution, Washington, D.C. She's also a practicing internist. And we have Dr. Joseph Alvernis, Director of Value-Based Analytics for the City of Hope. So welcome, and I'll kick it off. Dr. Vanderlaan, maybe I'll talk with you. As we spoke earlier a few weeks ago, I think you sort of pointed out this challenge with payers being nimble enough to both set policy, but on the flip side, allow for innovation and to sort of take into consideration new evidence. So from a payer perspective, I was wondering if you might talk about that.
Sure, thank you. You know, as I've been listening to the discussion today, it's been a very good meeting. I couldn't help but be struck by the fact that when you go to similar meetings of the health plan groups, the AHIP or ACHP or whatever, it sounds like they're talking a completely foreign language to what we've been talking about here. Their paradigm in the payer community, and I believe in the ACO community, is population health. And you know, the main tenets in population health are population-based quality and cost metrics, the whole population, like the total cost of care, a focus on prevalent chronic conditions like diabetes and the social determinants of health, which are so important, a desire to standardize treatment in the population to reduce variation through the use of guidelines and so on. And then, as you had just mentioned, coverage policy, which is sort of based on population efficacy, I know on large trials, or for example, mirrored by the FDA label, for example, in the case of drugs. And then along comes precision medicine or precision oncology, and it's really a very different paradigm. Here we have a focus on improving the health of a narrow number of patients, increasing variation because of the use of highly individualized therapy. It's not focused on prevalent chronic diseases or the social determinants of health, and actually will not generate improvement in the overall health of the population. So there is this interesting tension, I think, between the paradigm that health plans are sort of operating under. So some of the specific challenges and things that I think need to be addressed, first of all, we could just talk about coverage policy quickly since you brought it up. I think payers are going to definitely have to reevaluate the evidentiary basis that they use to determine coverage policy. And the science is moving so fast, as we've heard today, that large trials, we just don't have the luxury of waiting for them in order to craft appropriate coverage policy. So I think that, for example, when it comes to drugs, the P&T committees at plans are going to have to be more focused on different levels of evidence, adaptive clinical trials, registries, the TAPER study that was talked about today, phase 2 trials, basket trials, and there's a lot of really good evidence that's emerging. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about that. I think plans are going to have to become a little more comfortable with the notion of variation, because when you're individualizing therapy, that's going to become a given. And then finally, last comment, I think it's the issue around metrics. The plans really don't have metrics that adequately assess everything that's going on in precision oncology. Now, Dr. Green's presentation just a little while ago was very informative, and he had actually some suggestions about the types of metrics that one might consider adopting, I think, from the analytics he shared, that we probably need to think more about. But, so I think it is a big challenge. I think it's the fundamental tension between two different paradigms.
Great. Dr. Alvernis, your title is Director of Value-Based Analytics, which is interesting, and you might say a little bit more about what you do. But this concept of metrics, both at the population health level, but also at the individual patient level, I think is something that you're very focused on.
I think that this has been a great meeting for getting a sense of the parameters of the discussion, and I think there really is a tension between a set of sensibilities that are great when you're talking about managing 318 million people, but not so great if you use the same measures to measure, for instance, I take care of patients with ALL, we're talking about 6,000 patients diagnosed on an annual basis. So there's an extraordinary tension point. Part of it is that, again, the metrics don't transfer over. The second is the state of the art is advancing so rapidly that many of the existing measures or metrics are simply inadequate to measure effectiveness of care, because I think value lays in avoiding care mismatches as opposed to standardizing care in a stereotypical way. That part of my job is trying to create a language that's transparent enough and will transcend the limitations of ICD-9, ICD-10, CPT codes, so that you can spot good care when you see it and see care mismatches when they do occur. I think ultimately that's the formulation that will get us closer to reconciling these two extremes of population health.
So Dr. Patel, you have some extensive experience in federal policy, having worked with the administration and advising policymakers. As you hear this tension, is this something, how do we deal with this from a policy perspective, from a major payer perspective like CMS? We think about what should be regulated, what shouldn't be regulated, where we draw the line, especially in this era of kind of new emerging technology. Having advised at the policy level, how does this play out?
So I think that every time I come into a conversation around personalized medicine, I cringe a little bit because, I'm not exactly sure we all have the same operational definition of what that means. And then when you try to translate that for any sort of policymakers, be they federal, state, or I'm sure you can talk about even kind of regional health plans and people who are kind of typically in the, more senior administrative roles, but don't understand the clinical depth as you do. Nobody really wants to tackle how to, be nimble on policy while allowing for the kind of standardization that federal payment policy, for example, must have. So I think the biggest problem, I thought that the presenters prior to our panel kind of really hit the conundrum, kind of the nails on the head. I think Dr. Zafar, one, kind of rightfully pointing out that all policymakers, including like the three tools you talked about, ASCO, NCCN, and Sloan Kettering, really didn't even take into consideration the patient aspect of personalized medicine or drug costs and all of the following. But then from a policy payment standpoint, if you can't do that at the level that we discussed in kind of three more nimble, movements in three organizations, how do you expect CMS to do that? So I think the problem is that we're trying to, and we're seeing this right now with the health insurance exchanges. It's a much smaller market, but we're seeing the, quote, volatility or the variance around cost and kind of the conundrum around how we define standard benefits, even though we actually have definitions for essential health benefits. Those are all the reasons that when you get to something like oncology, personalized medicine, then you get to precision medicine, that it becomes, quite honestly, too difficult to legislate, nor do you want to. So I would almost say that there's the challenge for this audience, this community, stakeholders like the three of us that are up here, is how can we deal with the fact that we're dealing, we've got a very basic infrastructure that's very much outdated, outmodal, even our health technologies, I would argue, are completely outdated as we're using them today, yet we need to kind of build, the moonshot, vehicle in those technologies, in those policies. And that's where I think there's a lot of room for creativity, but I haven't seen as many of the solutions that I know the three of us would like to see.
Great. And by the way, feel free to respond to anything each of you say. And for the audience, if there are questions, raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you. Feel free to ask those questions at any point. So we talked about metrics, but the balance between, this is the patient-centered oncology conference, so this idea of the patient perspective or patient-reported outcomes. Where do you see the need for the balance between the clinical metrics, both at the population level and the individual patient level, versus the role of patient-reported outcomes in this debate?
I think this is something that we work on as an institution, is how to judge from the patients whether or not we're getting our job right. And I like your question, because I think sometimes when we think about personalized medicine, we become so fixated on molecular diagnostic studies that we forget that we're thinking about a person. And I think to the extent that we connect all this technology and plans and things that we can do to honoring the humanity of that person and their family, the closer we get towards, I think, doing the right things. And I think that is probably the better value proposition rather than one that's technology centric. For us, it's finding the right evaluation tools to glean from our patients whether or not we're adequately serving their needs. And that's tough. I haven't seen a perfect tool yet, but I've seen iterative improvements in existing tools that I think get to that.
I think that we're already seeing the limitations of, we were just talking about federal payers. I mean, we know that kind of CMS and generally speaking, public payers over-reliance on, I would say, also outdated survey instruments. Let's take kind of CAPS and CG CAPS and some of the instruments that are mandated for use. Don't do anywhere near what I would say a patient wants. And then I'll just flip into like I'm a primary care physician, and I sometimes use these conference topics to kind of ask my patients like what they think. So I ask my patients, of whom I have I'd say about 15% of them have an active cancer diagnosis that I co-manage with oncologists. But I've asked all patients, you know, what do you think about personalized medicine? What do you think about population health? The responses are universal across SES, across any sort of race, ethnicity. Patients actually think we're delivering personalized medicine because they think of it as every patient gets treated very specifically to their needs. And I think every doctor feels like they're trying to do that. So I still think that the PROs and the conversations we have at the policy level don't actually necessarily reflect what really matters to patients. That's what it seems like. We're doing just a really bad job at it. And I think we've done ourselves a disservice, including, I'll say, the Obama administration, by putting this over-reliance on the word patient in so many of the entities and things that we've done, that we've almost made ourselves feel good that we've actually covered issues about the patient in these policies, and I don't think we have.
Mm-hmm. You know, you also raised earlier when we were talking this issue of financial health literacy, which is interesting. We hear about health literacy, but you talked about financial health literacy, both on the part of patients and providers. Can you talk a little bit more about?
When I worked in the administration, I wanted to try to inject a little bit more of a forced conversation around things like co-payments, deductibles, premiums, out-of-pocket costs. That was something that, in the end, the rules and regulations around the explanation of benefits tried to cover those issues. I don't think that they have. Most physicians that I work with, and I would say that some of the previous studies that were mentioned illustrate this, that most physicians are not equipped to talk about kind of the financing of healthcare with patients, and most patients, when they come to access the healthcare system, and you must see this at the plan level, when they come to access the health system at the first time, are actually kind of shocked by how little they know about their own kind of co-payments, premiums, deductibles, and I think that that's part of the problem. And in cancer, it becomes increasingly dramatic when you have closed formularies or, you know, 4-tiered formularies. So you may have, quote, coverage for a particular drug, but it's 80% out of pocket. And so it just gets back to there's no, whether it be Consumers Report or ProPublica or any of these media-based resources, it's very hard to get information. And in the United States, it matters on where you get care. So you can't even use experiences from one market to another to make those assumptions.
I guess I would just add to that, one of the other things that lacks transparency is we can go online and look and see what a car costs.
Right.
We can shop at 20 different places.
Right.
But I think the two problems with that is we don't commoditize every part of healthcare. And I would argue that if we try to, then we lose the integrity of care delivery that allows us to take a very sick patient and hopefully have one who's restored to health at the end of it. So I don't know how to reconcile those two things.
Right, I agree.
Dr. Van der Leen, what can or what is the plan role here in terms of, you know, with all the change, with all the innovation, the challenge of processing information, you know, studies that happen in clinical trials and studies that are happening within systems, how do we educate, how do we communicate? You know, for example, over lunch, I was talking with a clinician who was saying that, you know, it would be nice if my EMR sort of interfaced with the plan's formulary and the patient's benefit design so that at the point of prescription, I could sort of understand not only what the patient's out-of-pocket costs would be for different agents, but also what the payer's costs would be. I would imagine that's feasible from an HIT perspective if we could get systems to talk to each other. And so I'm wondering what, you know, what the plan role might be here.
Yeah, well, I wish I had a quick, easy answer and a solution to that one.
You want that too.
You know, I thought again, and I really appreciated Dr. Green's presentation when he talked about the fact that data is unstructured and it's siloed, and that's not just in the database he was referring to. I mean, that's endemic. And so I thought it was really impressive that they've been able to put some of that together. And then I think that's everyone's goal. You find in different communities there's different, you know, levels of integration in common healthcare databases. We certainly look at it. I know other states, there are a number of initiatives, but we obviously have a long way to go. It's a big challenge.
Yeah. So another statistic that's been sort of talked about by multiple speakers is the very small percentage of patients that are in clinical trials. And I think the implication is that that generates a certain level of evidence on a certain population, but yet we hear about all these other studies that are being done in, you know, I guess in the proprietary arena. So, you know, I guess the question I'd like to ask is thoughts regarding how we need to, or whether there are any sort of solutions, you know, for generating evidence, sharing evidence so that we can all benefit from it, or is it, you know, sort of everyone, you know, fend for themselves?
If I can begin to tackle that. So just a little background. The state of California voters voted $5 billion for stem cell research that was used to fund initially technical research projects, but they then had a series of grants for creating these alpha clinics. And City of Hope was awarded one of those grants. And as we've talked about that, what we wanted to do in the alpha clinics was, and we've argued for this paradigm, treat it like an IT company, where instead we're looking at these projects as disconnected from each other. How can we leverage population-based health and find our audience and then effectively develop marketing plans for our clinical trials to make them meaningful to patients? So what we're doing is we're using the UC BRAID system as part of our, which is this great 11 million person database to look for patients who may need clinical trials or could benefit from them, and then we're developing with marketing plans. I mean, we work in an area where there are 127 different spoken languages, so we've got everything from standard marketing to multi-ethnic marketing, trying to make sure that these things can be deployed equitably. So what we've argued is we should see the grant from the state of California as venture capital for us to find a creative way to do it well, and I think it's linking all these disparate knowledge bases from other areas, and for us it's identifying the population broadly and then planning in a way that involves marketing and communication and stepping outside of our comfort zone as researchers to engage patients on an entirely different level.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Patel, you know, from a policy perspective, do you think we need to change the way the NIH funds research, you know, to do, you know, some of the things that, for example, were just mentioned?
Changing the way the NIH does research. Short answer is probably not, but I think what you're asking is could Congress see fit through some of the 21st century cures and some of the legislation that's already dealing with the NIH to think about kind of boosting this as a priority? And I think the answer is yes. And certainly I would say that we've got some winds of change with an administration change in a year, and you'll see if cancer always is a priority, but you'll see with whether appointments to the NIH, if that leadership does change, then you could see potentially an emphasis on this. But I think that it can't just come from kind of what I would say the upstream funding or policy. I think it has to get through to kind of community-based practices community-based practices and centers who don't see it as such a tumultuous barrier to get involved with clinical trials. I think there are many examples of community-based oncologists who have very successful ways of helping to screen and enroll patients, but that's not necessarily widely scaled. And I would say it's actually the same reason we're having a problem as a country with people realizing that they can get health insurance if they want it, if they don't have it. There are still, about half of Americans who don't even really know what the Affordable Care Act is. And I would say that you're seeing the same smaller version of that problem with access to clinical cancer trials.
Hey, and just one other thought that we mentioned before as well, though. I don't think the focus has to be on everyone getting into a large phase 3 randomized trial, which is expensive, time-consuming, and probably impractical for a lot of the questions that we want answered that have been raised, today throughout the meeting. So again, the registry-type data is valuable, used appropriately, phase 2 trials, et cetera. So.
Great. We have any questions in the audience? Yep, looks like we have.
Great discussion, thank you. Any thoughts on whether the shift from fee-for-service to value-based care is incentivizing or disincentivizing a more patient-centric care?
Well, so the question, if I understand it, was, is there any evidence or sense that the shift to value-based care away from fee-for-service care is enhancing patient-centered care? I don't really know that we've got evidence to suggest that yet at this point. It's still pretty early in the transition. I think if the metrics around which the value-based care are selected correctly, you might think that would be the case. But unfortunately, at least from what I see, those metrics are still sort of the traditional cost metrics that really aren't getting at everything that we've been talking about today in terms of what really matters to patients. So my answer is it's probably not happening yet.
The one thing that I've seen is that in the past, physicians rarely talked about issues of cost, of sustainability of healthcare. So as risk has shifted onto us to some extent, we're having those conversations and looking for ways of systematically improving processes, care delivery, avoiding care mismatches. So I think towards that end, I think we're taking greater responsibility as providers to ensure that what we do is value-based. So I think that re-examination, that self-examination has been powerful. Whether or not it translates into real action is a different question.
The other, part of the move to value-based payment is a move to shifting risk to the provider community. I mean, there's lots of activity going on that is essentially moving risk to the provider community. So that raises some interesting questions. Maybe I don't have the response, but it would be interesting to see a show of hands. If you were a cancer patient, would you want to know that your oncologist is at risk for the cost of your care? Who would like to? A few. Thoughts, Joe? What would you say about that?
Well, I think, ultimately we want to make sure that we don't create economic incentives for undertreatment. So I would want to know if my provider was at risk as a way of maybe making sure that the incentives were aligned correctly. And to maybe even asking, what are you doing to make that sustainable?
So at a minimum, that transparency has to be there. The patient certainly needs to know what those arrangements are.
I think so, and I think we need to be better in practice about creating transparency about what we do, what we're delivering, and why we make the decisions that we do. That's very opaque these days.
I'll just say that I think that the shift, I don't think the country has made, the shift is something we keep talking about. I actually don't think we've made the shift. We're still in a predominantly fee-for-service basis. Even these, the next panel will talk about ACOs, but ACOs to me are just kind of dressed up fee-for-service, vehicles. So I would say that in an ideal world, a shift to value-based payments will be more patient-centered, but not because what we're seeing right now is kind of indicative of what that promise is. I think it's still yet to be determined. And not only is our delivery system very opaque, but I really just don't think we understand what patients really want. I mean, most people will tell you that what they really want is a little bit more time with their doctor and feeling like their doctor really is doing what they would do for their own family. I mean, when you look at kind of critical questions around oncology or decisions and decision making, people will often say to probably all three of us, but certainly anytime you're making a critical decision, such as your health, It's what do you think is best? And most people refer and think that their doctors are making the best decisions. So I think patients want to know that if we're shifting to something different or doctors are paid differently, that it'll help them practice to kind of the top of their license and also practice in a team that communicates. And I don't know if they care so much about whether that's in a fee-for-service setting or in a global capitated setting or XY or an episodic/bundled setting. They just want to see those outcomes that they desire. And so I think the tension is we talk a lot about population management. Physicians or clinicians generally have to manage a population, but the truth is that patients want to be managed as individuals and personalized selves. And that can create a tension.
Well, we're just about ready to get into our dressed-up fee-for-service vehicle panel. I like that. But
I'm confident that's exactly what they'll call it. So they're, you know.
Before we do that, I can't resist, Dr. Vanderleen, you talked about, patients wanting to know if their physicians were in some sort of risk-based arrangement. I guess what I wanted to ask you is, talk about the conversations you have with providers as a plan in terms of taking on risk and sort of, which providers, this is a big discussion, but it seems like that's an important conversation there as well.
It is, and there's a lot of interest on the part of the provider community to take on risk, quite frankly. And I think when it's done right, sort of in a more global sense, it could be workable. But again, these things are just in the early stages. And they certainly, as was pointed out, do not comprise a significant percentage of reimbursement yet at this point.
Right. Great. Well, we're out of time, and I'd like you to thank the panel. Thanks very much.